Dita terang atsun tani mang chishu de poba yang sare, tani jaman kashi o sare, tani nupshok mayang kashi ndu, tani mang chishu de tani poba yang sare, tani tsangmala, tani tombar samtu tashi de la zhiga yun.
Most of everyone here today are Tibetans. There are also a few Chinese people and some Westerners as well. I'd like to start by saying good afternoon and dashi dele to everybody.
Tani terang atsun tana mamambozu nyamda tsone, tsangmala tani kacha shaki tani gorkup shungwa, tila tani ngarang ranglam tsona pe sem pe gabu shungsung.
And I'm very happy to have this opportunity to be with everyone here today and have the chance to engage in conversation.
Tani shirtang atsu tani tani manga chunta o tani rizala sanlo tana sacha Amerikan tani rizala tani dedin kantsiya na tani pogun nangzi ti saha liba ta rambo re tani puni netsar kandi yana, netsar kandi chungo yana, shawa leka kari lega yana, chindiz yana te haliba tani chigu yang shirgona tezi kabo tani rizre.
On the one hand, in America, it's very far from Tibet, it's far away, and for people to obtain an understanding of the situation in Tibet, what's happening, information about the society there, it's not necessarily easy to have access to this information.
Tarta yena tini nga tsu ta longchen re, nyamchen re, tani kyabarta tini chawa ka toni panchan tsangma tini mrini de yore, te yo tsardi tani nga tsu tini nangla shawa kari yo nandra, leka kari lega yo nandra, tani kaja kari shaka yo nandra, taso tamchipo nga mandra wo tini kabo tini mare mangchi waza tini tsangma ka tini shivjinba tini re.
But on the other hand, we also live in an age of interconnectedness through modern technology such as radio, television, the internet, etc. So in some ways, knowing about what people are talking about, what kinds of things are being done in Tibet these days is not as difficult as it used to be.
Tiri te yina ta shawa yang kashi tani ji shawa jibcha chongchong yina tani yang ji shima shinda oda goma go yang tani yore yang mambozu ke tani yang ji shawa jibcha tani shawa leka so yang te gona samkan da tani yang tani aso bogna na yujiri tani wazu ke tani nafshokon bo jamba na la yujiri.
However, in terms of understanding about the details of things that are happening, these might not be able to be so easily understood. So there are probably people here, Tibetans and Westerners, who have an interest in these things.
Tindi hindi tini nga tsu tini bogna la tini karze ga tini ta shawa leka kandi lega yo tini zingne terang tsamala ngorcho jigen.
So, for example, the issue of vegetarianism in Tibet and what is happening in this area is what I'm going to talk about today.
Tini shirtang ngarang rangla tini ta karze ga korla tini chu musar ga tsamala ngorcho chiandra tini ga charge ki me ta yenda tari nga so pemzo kanga tini ga tini george tini sam kodrik shene ta titone ngorcho shena yakbo yinsare sone konsogo tini songunduk ta tiyina titone tsikar chini zijana samgayo.
I didn't originally start out planning to talk about vegetarianism, but the library, the Lhasa library, in fact suggested this topic to me as something they thought that would be good if I could talk a bit about, so I will share with you a few thoughts on this today.
Tani ta nga tsu boba tani songo ta sarje ga songo nala tani ngama ni tani ta lo tong tsosi da gongro ni sarje ga song mambo jagar ni sar girne tani che yore ta tsu tsama ga nala tani che karze ga korta tani mamboz tani ta song du.
The Buddhist scriptures dating back well, more than 1,000 years, 2,000 years, contain a lot of references to vegetarianism.
Tani tasu tamche bom do nalayang mambo song yore, ngaka nalayang mambo song yore.
There are references, many references in both the sutra and the tantras.
Tani kwaga nanglayang, kwanjirga nanglayang sondag, tanjirga nanglayang sondag, mambozu sondag.
As well as in the Buddhist canon in the Khenchen and the Denja, there's both of them contain references and discussion of vegetarianism.
Tani ngarang tsogo bobaga tani lama tsogo tani tsamjagbi tani songchu te so nanglayang tani karjaga kora tani mambo tani taga sondag.
As well as compositions and works written by Tibetan lamas in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition.
Tani somba te yang aso jimta shukching rawo ta chuju shukching rawo tani se rembendu tani aso tani sarge kwarnyang kanda kangap shoni yenna suso jimta suso tani ta lama nam ko tani masongwa masong kanga jimta sa chik jambendu chama ga nala tani ta karje ko ta mampo songdu.
So this isn't something that is exclusive to particular lineage or schools or traditions. Across the Tibetan tradition, everybody has given attention to vegetarianism.
Tani yinnayang tani ngatso tani lagling ka toni teza tani ta boga nanglola tani karze ka toni lagling ta ngatso zhongli ka nana somba tawa tani yakbozu yongyaw mare.
However, in terms of actual practice, the actual application of these vegetarian ideas, Tibetan society hasn't mirrored what has been advocated in the scriptures.
Tani laglin mayong wa gimsen da kang rezena tani ngarang so boga sachan rawe na chama ha ko re tani sachan thumbu re tani pena chu gyag sachan ra yang na chu sacha te chu tombu ra wo ka sacha la sacha tombu yo re te so nani tani chu to ta dumbu korwa chuma korwa te tani par boga sacha ga tani te jamba chola tani kherni rolgona ndrimdr re kangsho te ngamanda boyen na tani langkhonda the zoyong mambo yo mare te na hale ba tani tam modi gare.
And the reason for this is, as everybody knows, that Tibet is a land of extremely high altitude, and although it does have some areas of warmer climate, historically and traditionally, transport has been extremely limited and difficult, so it hasn't been possible, say, for vegetables in one area to be readily transported to other areas.
Tani nga so boba zena tani ta mamboz dum jogbare tani chabar dum jogba sa chatela tani ta ngo ta dumbuta and so shanto yenda ja tani choma yenda ja ganda gans tani kirgona te hajang tani kikamore sa chatela yang kig mare tani sacha janz ni par kirjo gona yang halepa gangar chimbore.
And nomads and herders comprise a large section of the Tibetan society, and in nomadic areas it's extremely difficult to grow fruits and vegetables or to transport fruit and vegetables grown in other places to these areas.
Tani tani yimbi jimsenji tani ta nga so tani jong na la mambo zo song yore ta yena tani lagleng thone ta te karje sa gona te kamunda o tani yimbi jimsenji tani lagleng yak boz mayong ware lo ji thola.
So, historically speaking, even though there has been much advocacy or discussion of vegetarianism in scriptures, for the reasons I just mentioned, climate and difficulty of transport, these ideas haven't been well implemented in practice.
Yinayang tani kangar tani yonayang ta tarong yang tinane tani yang aso ngama lorji go thola yang tani karje Zankendang, teni chak marzi, teni mazanken, teni meba mari, teni yang lama yang ngong lama haliba katak jam mambo yang teni karzi mazanken, teni yang teni shung du lorji go thola.
Despite these difficulties, however, it's not the case that there were no lamas in the Tibetan tradition who were not vegetarian. There were, of course, lamas, extremely high lamas, who were vegetarians at times in Tibetan history.
Ta yinda ante nga tsupo ko gendam bala teni samlo tana te changat nyung re ma to teni mambuz mare.
But if we look at these numbers of lamas or practitioners in light of the total numbers of the Buddhist Sangha, then they were in the real minority.
Pena gelu ke shogla samlo tan ba na jafkar tsotug randur teni to la sopa lama mambo go teni peti thola for
example, in the Gelug tradition, this lama,
yeah.
For example.
Yeah. So mambo yores.
Yes, advocated vegetarianism in a lot of his writings.
된지. 되는 가서 냥마가 되니 쇼라 산로 담바이나 되니 냥라 파마 든들 라소바양 할리바가 되니 또 접접산기 매체 바레다 연당 고소고요. 가르제가 돌아 mambo 송고요래.
In the Numa tradition, the highly realized practitioner also also very much advocated vegetarianism.
냥라 파마 든들.
Islama.
다 딘디인디 다롱양 되니 추기 소소라 점타 소소라 딘디 라마 mambo 라마 카트자 mambo도 참아가 되니 송 쇼득신이 따땅아서 되니 참아 쇼득신이 딘디 뎁딘디 요래 되나 참아가 되니 송 mambo 딘디 너스.
So from all different lineages and traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, there were lamas who wrote a lot on vegetarianism.
되니 라마 티초 콘소고 되니 송와 짱와 차가 말에 코랑초 되니 다 가르지 잔켄 되니 지샤 마잔켄 되니 딱딱레스 콘소.
And it wasn't just in terms of what they were preaching or advocating in words, they were literally vegetarian in their practice.
옛날 되니 다 망치슈디 되니 가서 되니 다 샤잔켄들이 딱딱레스.
However, the great majority of Tibetan people and members of the Sangha were meat eating.
되니 때 겐든 바가 돈다 그래. 되니 가서 망초고 나라이나 다티 보바가 망초고 나라 되니 참아 샤잔켄 다다마도 바 파르치 샤마잔켄다 할리바드니 자차 찌요 찌영 파르치 요기 말에 할리바 뇽뇽레스 할리바가 뇽뇽레스.
So if that was the situation among the Sangha, then among the lay populace of Tibetan society, the numbers of vegetarians were even fewer. Whether or not there might have even been 1% vegetarian is difficult to say. At any rate, vegetarians were very, very few.
되니 대양 카요 말에 그러면 비 gemsenting 네 다리 공라 샤파준다 가서 로바가 차버던 로바가 사차다 티솔라 되니 샤마자나 샹도요 말에 되니 모듬니요 말에 된자와즈 그때니 르르기나 되니 하장가 mambo요 말에 된지 옛나 되니 된지 코릭스 그나라 되니 샤마자진나 할레바가 되니 카보리 콤보리 짐슨 티셔나 되니 샤마잔 그 mambo 문두지 포티 가서 만속고나라.
But of course, you know, the reason for this is completely understandable. Living in areas where vegetables were very limited and even grains were limited in some situations, people didn't have a choice about whether or not to eat meat, and so it's clear for this reason that's why there were very, very few vegetarians.
되니 가서 과당 담주당 되니 라마 고만함 그때니 샤마자 손에 송도야티 김승 강라 되니 송고요리 제나스.
So what were the reasons given in the Buddhist scriptures and by individual lamas in favor of vegetarianism?
시르티니 가서 샤마자와 텔라 되니 김승 mambo요레 가르선 대랑 잠볼랑 거 토나 가시가시는 코릭 종접 그 돈달라 삼로다니 샤마잔 켄텐리 양 요레.
In general, there are many reasons advocated in favor of vegetarianism. These days in the world, for example, one of the reasons used to promote vegetarianism is the protection of the natural environment.
되니 가시근의 소속을 리포 대탕라상로다니 샤마잔 켄텐리 양 요레.
And other people follow vegetarianism for their own physical health.
되니 가시는 되니 코랑초고 출르그 나라 되니 더 샤마자와 시고 손에 되니 손으로 받든지 짐슨지 샤마잔 그냥 요레.
And then there are others who follow a vegetarian diet because their religious tradition requires it.
되니 나랑초 되니 더다 보고 되니 가마 샤자만년 손이 더 손대와티 쪼고 강레지나 되니 쪼쪼지 코리스통 좀 라오다 리포데 탕다 되니 돈이 쪼샤게요 말에 쪼티 되니 샴당 녀지가 돈이 샤근도.
But in the Tibetan tradition, the main reason underpinning vegetarianism was not protection of the natural environment or for one's personal physical health, but rather for reasons of compassion and loving kindness.
되니 가서 되니 다 보고 르닌디 나라 되니 때랑 가서 나라 요 받은 망치슈도 파치 보바르인도 되나 되니 참아가 되니 하고래 되니 쪼데 가서 돈다가 니 돈이 되니 추제나다 르네자난 디톨라 하장 같으니 참아가 돈다 침볼라 저거림 통침시에 근도스.
So given the fact that most people here today are Tibetan, you probably all know very well that compassion and loving kindness are very important tenets of our religious and cultural tradition.
Deni tonda ni te kan rezina tonda tambo te nga chu teni legim de la teni te samlo tang ni legim de tamo de mo she pa te la to aso bo ba ring zena chibare chu zena chigre te la hali pa teni te thongchen tsagres.
I'm sorry, the first of the two important tenets of Tibetan religious and cultural tradition is a belief in the cause and effect, so the karmic results of action undertaken.
Teni ni pa te teni te ta sham da nyar jin da la teni te bo ba teni ring ne na la hali pa ton tak chimbo tsagndus.
And the second being compassion and loving kindness.
Teni yena teni gimchen ni te la teni nga so te ta ripi Jean-Luc Tola teni nga so karzi tengore sone mambo zo son de aga gimchen te terindus.
And so for the main reasons that vegetarianism was advocated in the scriptures was related to these two things, cause and effect and compassion.
Teni ta shirtang teni pena khori chong chob da teni ge thola ta nga chu teni boba ge teni shaza wa ta shir khoi glan ti khori ke pena chokchak ta chong chong da teni la no pa thep kare ma to ba shirtang khori chong chob da so thola no pa hale pa chembo thep maris.
In general, in the Tibetan tradition,
chokchak chong chob ko thola no pa teni thep kare ma to ba shaza na khori chong chob ko thola no pa chembo thep maris.
So with the exception of the harm that's done to the animal by eating meat, in general in the Tibetan tradition, the eating of meat was not considered to be something damaging or harmful to the environment.
Tegang rezena perna America la sopa nabshokla teni ta te zog mambo la teni mdrig mambo jin ta ten da was ti thola ch mambo te da la teni chola ta ten ru shini ti sha jama kang ton da la mdrig jama mambo teni ta chola ta go re te na teni mdrig mambo teni sha ga ton da la ro yo re ch mambo sha ga ton da la chola ta go yo re khori thola halle ba ga chola mambo ta go yo re nabshokla.
In the West, the rearing of cattle consumes a lot of and wastes a lot of resources. For example, the amount of grain and water that are required to raise cattle and sustain their lives, and this creates a lot of strain and harm for the natural environment.
Teni nga tsu boban ra na teni ta zola teni mrig mambo jinge da o ta ch mambo teni te chola ta jinda teni yo mare te na te khori ko thola ta na tun chimbo chimbo dus.
However, in the Tibetan situation, it's not needed to specially give water to the cattle or provide food and grain for them. So in terms of their strain on the environment, it's considerably less.
Tena nga tsu teni sha maza zini songwa te teni khori ko ton da kyamba mare.
So in advocating vegetarianism, it's not a matter purely of protection of the natural environment.
Teni nga tsu teni zupu de thang kyamba ton da yang mare zi teni ta zupu de thang nga tsu teni ta pena popa sha za wala teni sacha jamba la mepi teni nat teni yang teni kashi ndozi ta yinda teni ta sha te za jang na yinda manda nat chi po zren ro ji teni jing chapchin re mandozi.
So also from the point of view of physical health, that's also not solely the reason for vegetarianism. Of course, there are diseases related to the consumption of meat, but this is not a particularly serious problem in Tibet.
Teni indi savi sawango ma ta kangla samlo tang ga yori jina teni shamnyar ji tang teni stokchak tham je pon ramni mem ba semchen ga chokla teni to chunjuk she pa te dagla teng ga yori.
The real key reasons behind vegetarianism are the cause and effect and loving kindness, the viewing of animals as with equality in terms of all living beings.
Teni ta tarta nga chu teni ta bog na la de chu pe na longkhor ga lam teni ta sa cha mambo zala teni yores.
In Tibet today, there are a great many roads.
Teni chongba mambo ga teni ta sa cha teni te jombo sa cha te sola teni ta ngo mambo tabni choma mambo tabni te yara teni pok sa cha jamba teni ta ngo mebi sa cha te sola kherni teni chong yore je chongba cho.
And so these days there are a lot of business people who are planting vegetables in more low-lying, warmer areas and then transporting them to higher areas where vegetables don't grow.
Teni chongba de cho kashi is yami is kashi nga cho boba rang is.
Some of these business people are Chinese and others are Tibetans.
Bendanga cho teni te kamshok teni ta choma chongsa ga teni chomra to so na la joni tana ta tina la yami yang kashin de boba yang de chaman jamnim ra bore teni boba ga yang sacha mambozla ta choma tabni par chong yore.
If we were to go and look at the vegetable markets around centres in Kham these days, we'd find that there are both Chinese and Tibetans selling vegetables.
Tani yamba chikta tani tarta nga tsu te chupe na sertan rawo tani ka samthumbo yin na di nang la tani jodkang jodyo saka kangpa te gyabni di nang la tani tsoma ramanda mambo tani deb tabgo yores.
And then in really places of high altitude like Seta, for example, it's possible now to plant vegetables and grow vegetables in greenhouses.
Tani nga tsu rongpa tsu yang soso tani sajanga nang la tani tsoma tabni tani shi denka yang mambo ndoz.
And of course many farmers growing vegetables in their own fields.
Bena nga tsu changon rada, kamshokni changon rada, taun rada tso tani nyenkor la tani koso tsoma mambo tabni tsoma tsu kerni par zongni tani tsong gyab denka ka tani boba yang mambo ndoz.
So in areas of Kham like Drango and Dau, there are farmers who grow vegetables in their own fields and then harvest them and take them to sell in local markets.
Kyabarta nga tsu gyarungo tani shokla, tani gyarungo popa soyo na tani sacha chumbure, tina la tani tsoma mambo kiga yore, tani koso gyarungni yara nga tsu serta ta, tani teso lan rorgo na yang, tani langkor ka tani tezi tab debure yore, tani di nani, tani tsong gyab dinkende, yarka yang yore, gengka yang yore, namgin yore, gangla yang tsoma mambo rezi tarta.
And especially in the border area of Gyarung, which is quite warm, there are a lot of people who grow vegetables in this area and then take them up to Seda, and you can find people doing business in the vegetable trade all throughout the year, through every season.
Tandi yendi tani tarta ta nga tso tezi girju jab go sare nga tso tar nga yan chuyin na tani nga tso chu nangla tani shamazawa ta mambo song yore ta yenda nga tso korik te yakbo me pa ti jimsanji tani shamazawa ta lagling toni yakbo zi tani mayung ware yenda tarta tani ta lagling la shiv jangna tezi tani ta ngor mata ti tso yore na ta nga tso girju jab go go zini tani girju jab go yore zi pok nangla.
So for these reasons, these changed circumstances, it's necessary to make some changes, make some reform in light of our practices. So whilst for environmental reasons, the religious ideals were not able to be applied or implemented so easily in the past, in light of more recent changes, then it's easier than it was before.
Tani girchu gyagati kanga thola gyab ko yore zina tani nga tso gomba ga nangla gyab ko yore jaba ta lama ga tani to ten tsowa ti thola girchu gyab ko yore.
And in what area do we need to engage in this reform or make these changes? Well, it's among the monasteries and among the members of the Sangha that we need to see these reforms take place.
Tani gendan ba ga nangla tani tezi nga tso tani gomba ga nangla tani cho shik chenpon ra wo shini tani So
really what's happening now, the greatest effort in promoting vegetarianism is taking place within monasteries and among the religious Sangha.
Bena gindan nam nyamda tinin tsoni tsokban ran tsok chusong ran tsok tanishi pikapsa tani ta tsamaga nyamda tini taga shamangbo ga tukban ra koyan ra tanishi ni gindan ba tsamaga nyamda tini ta gomba tinang la taba gyayo na nivgyayo na tsamaga nyamda tini sha suya tanishi tini ngama chorjunga tokla tsama tanishi res.
So everybody here, well, the majority of people here being Tibetans probably are quite clear about the situations in your own home areas. Traditionally speaking, in monasteries, at times of assembly of the Sangha, when the members of the Sangha would get together and eat communally, there would be a lot of meat consumed.
Tayana nga tsu tani mang chishus ka nangla tani 토머 곰바 ngacho tumung 고 고니 뭐 망보고 냠드 드니 때 샤자와도 메바시 차르레.
However, these days, not in all monasteries, of course, not in 100% of monasteries, but in many monasteries now, when it is time for eating communally, that people, the Sangha now does not eat meat, they eat vegetarian food.
앞에나 아주 장고리 세타리 냐그롱리 다트소고 참마거든이 곰바 참마가 나라 되니 나마이나 되니 아주 초상가 나라 되니 샤가 특바군이 되니 소야 어떤지 요래다 때 초상마직장 메바시 차라레지 다다.
So now in areas like Seta and Drango and Nyarong, whereas previously when Tok assembly would be held, there would be, for example, tukpa consumed with meat in it. These days that has completely been done away with.
되니 땡아초 셔당 장고다 세타진 손시 잠레 마도 바테 캬바 마리 다롱 아초 골로코 쇼라오다 티 mam보즈라 되니 더 레카 레니 다타 참마가 되니 야본라오 되니 용고요레.
So this isn't just something that's the case in that Drango and Nyarong or Seta are models or for these practices. Actually, there are many. This has been widespread practice now, including in parts of Golok and other areas.
되니 곰바가 텀뭉고 되니 자마 초상가 나라 되니 자마레 초바 쳔보고 되니 자마자지 더 참마 까르지 마토 바되니 디나라 되니 샤 직장 되니 레 무척지 되니 곰바가 되니 소소고 되니 첨작제 고난다 차지작제 고나 드글음작네 된디시에 살아레스.
So many monasteries have implemented rules or regulations that when communal assemblies are held, there is no meat to be consumed, that the food consumed at these times has to be vegetarian.
되니 자바초 양때 뭐 게르고 완듯이나 되니 가서 자바초이나 되니 더다 샤스자와니 마자와티 더 다롱 뭐 참마가 딘디 용요 말이지 가서 참마가 때라 레와 잡고 요리 자바이나 다 샤마자나 약 보레지니 레와 잡고 요리 때 있나요 뭐 게르고 토니 다 장킨 마장킨 참마 요리지 다롱.
In terms of individual monks, for example, individual monks, the current stance is not that they have to all be vegetarian. At this point in time, it's up to the individual whether or not they eat meat or not, but of course we have hope that eventually everybody will decide to become vegetarian themselves in their individual lives.
되니 뭐 게르고 되니 자마자지 티토라 되니 다 가르지 쉐기다 되니 참말라 레와 잡기다 되니 모크르 쉐기다 되니 로소 잡기 되니 마토바다 첨거 돈이 다 가서 되니 곰바치글라 타파 자탐바요나 자보티 소소 게르고 돈이 되니 샤자마 속자한다 되니 요마레스.
So while we certainly promote vegetarianism and encourage vegetarianism among members of the Sangha, there are no definite rules or decrees that every member of the Sangha must be vegetarian in their individual capacities.
베나가서 세르탑 라롱 그 가르라 되니 삼로당 바이나 되니 니스통 걸로 양철라 되니 가초 양 되니 다 겐든 바초 샤사 그레스.
Speaking in terms of Larongga itself, then before the year 2000, the Sangha was meat eating.
되니 니스통 걸로니 되니 곱증니 되니 가초 가르라 되니 더 샤 마자와 되니 더 가르 텀뭉 그 샤자 되니 메바시 바레스.
In the year 2000, it was established that during assemblies, communal meals at Larongga, that no meat would be henceforth consumed.
되니 강디시니 되니 샤자데 메바시 바레제나 되니 토머 가초 로리레가 나라 되니 가초 가르라 삼로토나 로리레가 나라 추석 침부 지리요레스.
So in arriving at this decision to do away with eating meat on these occasions, we took into the account that every year there are 4 main religious assemblies during the year.
되니 추석 지포티 나라 되니 뭐 하장 만부요레 또 셔당가서 가르금마야 만부요레다 옛날에 년콜라 용건 그 세탄라오다 저거 디 곰바초양 만부용 거래 되니 인디 뭐 하장 만부레지 추석 리라.
And at each of these prayer festivals or ritual assemblies, there would be a great number of people attending. So not just people from Larongga itself, but also people from surrounding communities, nearby monasteries. The number of people who would be at Larongga at these times would be very, very great.
되니 인디 가서 되니 다 뭐든지 만부질라 되니 샤가 되니 특바쿠 되니 시고나 tani ta shira mamboz kanala ndoni shanyo go yores.
In order to provide, say, meat tukpa, meat noodles for everybody who was attending these religious assemblies, it was necessary to go around to different slaughterhouses and buy a lot of meat.
Teni ta nga tsu los chik nala teni ta simchin kandi zika teni shar gogun dik tsabdaz jabi undi parchir teni ta los chik lo riri nala teni zok sha chachang zok sha chachang ma teni shagzik chachang wa jigya ni dungya teni gogun dik si lo riri nala.
And when we estimated approximately how many yaks, the entire bodies of cattle that we needed each year to fulfill these needs, we worked out that we probably needed between 600 and 700.
Tani lo chigla tani tugya dungya tani ziyana tani lo chaganala tani tongchak tugdan zirin res.
So if we were consuming 600 or 700 every year, that meant that in the space of a decade, we were consuming 7,000 or 8,000 animal lives.
Tani ta tani zire sondi ta tsavani rekomenduk zine tani nga tsu semtak chadni tani ta mepashi res.
And given the fact that this was utterly unacceptable, we decided at this point to do away with having meat on these communal occasions.
Tani nga tsu wopa sachala shirdang gendam ba gomba tsugonala haja mambo yores, gomba kangi na mambo res.
Of course, in Tibet in general, there are a lot of monasteries.
Tani tsama ga tani shini tani shazav jagna tani nga tsu samne ga tokla tani shira jemang res.
And if at each monastery the sangha and at prayer festivals that everybody is consuming meat, then the number of slaughterhouses also increases.
Tani ta semchen tani mambo la tani no pa semchen mambo chokla tani no pa liba tani chimborin ro.
And this brings extreme suffering and harm to the lives of an increasing number of living beings.
Tani nga tsu tani nistongo lola tani tsama ga tani chaba tsama ga mangchu go ni tani ta shaza jita mebashi res.
So in the year 2000, we decided in a democratic manner among the residents at Laronga to become vegetarian.
Tani nga tsu sha maza bakchi bo ma tsapi go ni tani nga tsu larong gartam dewa yongken ko gomba susu na la yang ta tani shini nga tsu ta shaza na yak bo mundik zini tsama ga shawa lekka ta tani leris.
So in addition to Laronga itself, we also promoted among monasteries that have connection with Laronga, we also advocated against eating meat and in favor of vegetarianism.
Tani tarta ga parda nga tsu tani nyolop changa tani ro yori tinang la tani halipa ga tani te shikchin yakbo thep tani shawa yakbo tani ro yoris.
And 15 years have passed since this first change was made, and over this time we've done a lot of work and have really achieved a great influence in this regard.
Tani tarong yang nga tsu tani shawa lekka ta mumthan ni tani te le yori tarong le ji chazi des.
And we are continuing this work and also plan to continue it in the future as well.
Tani te nga tsu tani gendam ba nga re tani mangsok na la nga tsu tani lekka ka nga le mes.
So these efforts that we're making are in relation to monasteries and the religious sangha.
Tani nga tsu ta thokta trawa ga thokta te chog na la kashi zina o mangsok la shaza chok yo mare chiri muri mampu se gre ta yena te mong kashi ga tani kajan ra mare sha ga dere ma to ba mangsok na la tani nga tsu shaza gore yang ze yo mare shaza machok yang ze me chi ze me ze mangsok na la.
So these days on the internet, there's quite a lot of discussion about this, and all kinds of people saying things like, "Oh, the ordinary lay members of the community are not allowed to eat meat; they shouldn't eat meat." But in actual fact, that's not what's been said. It's never been said that they can't eat meat or that they shouldn't eat meat. But what we do say is that members of the lay society should reduce the amount of meat that they consume.
Teni ti thola nga song khama ga zawi teni zokshanda likshanda phashanda teni korat ma to ba ta tarta jamda monam ji bonjamda za teni chigni jamda za teni shegare ta nga so boba ga teni khama yang teni zagmare todum maza zini nga so zega yos.
What we do say, of course, is that these days people's eating habits have changed. In addition to eating, say, traditional kinds of meat like mutton and yak meat and pork, for example. These days there are people eating all kinds of various types of seafood, etc. And we do say that people shouldn't be doing this.
Teni nganja ina teni rongpa la teni mambo teni royo tena ti kapsi teni rongpa chola teni shamazawa thola kandize yo zena dawa chikana la nima ni teni mazawa ti Khenchen yakbore zegayos.
And I travel frequently to nomadic and farming areas and address audiences in lay communities. And when I educate people about vegetarianism, what I do advocate is within every month being vegetarian for 2 days.
Teni nyama ni ta teni chita kare zena chongare teni chita namgare teni chonga da nawani ta teni tishin re teni kada mazana yakbore zegayos.
And the days that I advocate that members of the lay society be vegetarian are on the 15th day of the month and the other auspicious day of the Tibetan monthly calendar.
Tenga so boga nala ina chama ga teni dawa chi ga nala teni nyamani maza ba ta se na teni Khenchen shegen de tamshela chi kangar mandus.
This is an undertaking that is easy for everybody, every Tibetan to undertake. It's not difficult to take this on for 2 days in a month.
Te ma to banga so teni jambala teni chi ta da sha zawani mazawan ra o ta no teni yerang bon chi mazawan ra o ta teni ga chajin ra ta teni ga duthum ra ta teni chi yo mares.
So there is absolutely no insistence that people be vegetarian or that they have to be vegetarian for a long time or that there's some kind of dictation that they're dictated to that they should be vegetarian.
Ina teni ta ta sha mambo zana nga so teni ta ta lipola teni ta chi no pa mambo yongwan ra ta teni ga no kyo mambo yore na tena nyongza shina yakbore zini nga so loso to namjin gyab de yo ze bo ba na la.
But of course, eating a lot of meat is not good for the health, etc. So when we do advocate vegetarianism, we advocate what we are really advocating among the lay community, at any rate, is that people reduce the amount that they eat.
Tenti ending aso boba na la mansok na la ya pe na nyese bola shama zan kenta ota losim la maza lo nga la maza wa tenti mambo yongndo rete te so ran so koran so ota nyansa mare samne teni so rang re ma to pa teni jang chajin da teni mare.
So among the Tibetan community, there are, of course, increasing numbers of people taking on vegetarian practices, taking oaths to be vegetarian for either their entire life or for 3 years or 5 years or whatever it may be, but they're doing this completely of their own accord and not under any kind of imposition by anybody else.
Tindi in sarti tini atsu shilok la yo pi tini poba tsunta na tini ta charkin kangashone na halepa yagbores.
So in any case, the conditions for Tibetans who live outside Tibet are really good in terms of vegetarianism.
Tindi indi tini atsu tini shilok la yon kepe na Amerikan ra ota tiso la yon kenga tini ta chusok mambo yore tiso ina na la yon kenga tabatso tini nguni tani tini ngopshi ni tini shamazawa ta halepa garchimbores.
So it's really important that in the Dharma centers and religious institutions, Tibetan institutions outside Tibet, that the monks or lamas here pursue a vegetarian diet.
Perna Taiwan ra ota teni Singapore ra on so na la nga chu boba ga teni chusu hale pa mambore teni te in chati teni lama chu tin la sone shaza teni she de na teni koran chu 야가 되니 추대라 럭스트롤라 되니 거쳐 샤자나 페 득보스 요리 된디 인디 어 부바가 추대 득보레지네 거쳐 된디 럭탄다마다 mam보신 그 mam본도스.
In places like Singapore and Taiwan, there are a lot of Tibetan Buddhist centers, and so when lamas go there, if they continue eating meat, etc., well, this is against the prescriptions of Chinese Buddhism, and there are a lot of people who have objections to this. Objections to Tibetan Buddhist lamas consuming meat.
다 유럽 다더니 너쇼라 찍대 된디가 빼나 가서 추 돌아 거랑sol라 찍더니 다 된디 고거리 된디 고고 말해지 차지 mambo 메나 탕세 거서 된디 쫓침볼라 쓰가 메나 탕세.
It's possible that in Europe and in the West that there aren't as many prescriptions relating to diet, whether one can eat meat or whether one can't eat meat.
이나 되니 당가서 되니 다 상독자지요 되니 덤번 라면자 초만들이 mam보자지요나 teni shaza goya mandik te na indamanda gendamba cho teni jaba cho ta shamazawa to chego gores.
Nevertheless, given that there's an abundance of things like fruit and vegetables, then among members of the monastic sangha, it's essential that people living in these places be vegetarian and not eat meat.
Teni mangsoko nala ta nga so shilola yung kan on randare shertang teni sha mazana pe yabures te nyonyong ma tok ba mazana pe yabures.
And the same really applies for lay people living outside Tibet in Western countries too. Being vegetarian for them is extremely should be highly advocated, or otherwise eating only a small amount of meat.
Teni chabarda teni shilola yung kan teni sha pe na chi te sha na nya sha na teni tsu korwatila ta nangla teni ta sha na sha sowi ne kum nya na nya sowi ne kum la khoso go te sha so che ta nya so che ka zamati nangla tani manda ta pa ta mi lipola hale pa no pa yung go yore te hale pa ga teni ta shertang ka sha za wa ta manda wa teni ta lipola tele jang ta no chu mambon jong gores.
And the food that is fed to all kinds of birds, chicken and fish, etc., often contains all kinds of chemicals, and these are extremely harmful for the body when they're eaten.
Tela tana ta nga cho teni boba ga sacha ga teni te zok sha ta luk sha ta te so na la ina sherdang khorang teni sha mambo chi sha lomban da za teni chi jona lipola no kore ma to ba tin nang la teni tuk da da teni cho yo maris.
By contrast, in Tibetan areas, even though eating meat may have certain harmful consequences for the body in terms of it being meat, the quality of the meat, though, is not as there aren't as many chemicals or things like that being fed to these animals.
Teni yendi nga so shila yong kan ga teni ta teni boba so yin na yang teni nga so shila yo ma re kan ta boba yan charti teni nga so rang ringni te ta rang ringni ti na la yo ni te samlo te la teni laglen ayong mayong ta go res.
So regardless of whether we're talking about Tibetans outside Tibet or Tibetans in Tibet, in any case being a Tibetan, we need to pay attention to our cultural tradition and the implementation thereof.
Teni ngai tari kona shapa tere nga so tanga kongda tanga yanchula teni lo tong chak teng mambo rangla teni te ta sha teni zagre ta yang te go mare ta teni sengkhen yore ta ta mare te jimsen yo mare se.
So what I've spoken about before, our history of consuming meat for 1,000 or more years.
Teni nga so teni ta rigne ga nala yin na da teni nga so torgin ga nala yin na da ti nala teni yin rangbo yin na da teni nga so ji ton da mong chen ba yang na jan la no pa yong khen ga teni na jir ju jab go res.
What really needs to be reformed and changed is the fact that we continue practices which go against our cultural tradition and values and are harmful to other beings.
Teni teso tsama ga tsawa de kang la thgo re na teni tsawa de teni shamnyang ji la te go re.
And at the core of this is the value of compassion and loving kindness.
Teni zamba lang thola te murg jamba la teni tawa khem sar bo teni yores.
Of course, in the world today, there are other peoples and ethnicities with very strange attitudes.
Pena gandhi rezena nga chon zamba lang shar shok da nap shok tsama ga na la teni chokchak tso sama nga so chokbo yin ze ni teni zegres.
For example, in the West and in the East, there are a lot of people who regard animals as humans' friends.
Teni chokchak tso nga so chokbo yin bi gemsen che rezena ta pena chokchak chig tini yang nga so la no ba shin kan chokchak jan zan ro re te chokchak jan za jna tini nga so la no ba shin kan chokchak jenyong re ro re na ti gemsen ji korang nga so chokbo yin ze ni teni zegres.
And the reason that they consider animals human friends is that
chokchak jamba ga teni chokchak jamba za gres. Zana teni to chokchak jamba za jona teni pena barwa ga teni jankhala no pa mbo za gres. Teni jankhala no pa mbo me so na te nga so lotok yak po che gres. Teni insati teni barwa ta nga so teni chingwa nga so chokbo yin ze ni teni ze gres.
And they have this idea that animals are humans' friends based on the fact that we all belong to a food chain where one kind of animal eats another kind.
야, 리딩 아주 보바 같은 데서 말이지 샴녀지 같은 데가 고니 쪽착서당 서에 나더니 고졸라더니 녀지리 데 등물이오난 저거 말이 삼니 들으려 마토 바티 잠바가 솔라 삼스리오 말이지.
However, in Tibet, we don't really think like this. Our approach is underpinned by the idea that all animals are living beings and, as a result, need to be treated with compassion.
더니 연 잠발랑 거 돌아더니 쪽착 종교신 그 같은데 양만부요레스.
In the world today, there are also a lot of people who advocate for the protection of animals.
더니 양만부즈 그거서 쪽착 종교시 거의 염성 강레제나 쪽착도서 가데 메바레 소나 Tini nga tsu mula tini chi nopa tini zi yonggandu tini indi tini inda so nopa shi na nga tsu mula dikbo yonggare na tani chongkyu shi goya ga jimtsin tari zi ni tani ga goni chongkyu shi gandu zi mambo zi ka.
And a lot of these advocates of animal rights do so for the reason that if animals were to disappear, this would be of great harm to humans. So it is for this reason that they advocate for the protection of animals.
Tini nga tsu ti buk tini rigne ga nangla tini ta lama koma namji sha maza songwa nda ta tini chokchang chongchu she anda ta tsu tamshi po tini tawa mare zi changma simjin gangla yana tini ta dungmir yona nzhiga mare nopa shi na nzhiga mare samji tawa ti thoni tini ta chokchang chongchu she na ta she ga yore sha maza zi na jimsin te res.
However, in the Tibetan tradition, the idea that animals should be protected is not this. The reason is that they are other forms of, that they are other living beings and that they should be treated with compassion.
Tani ndo nga tsu tini to murik ndi tini rinne ze nan ra nga tsu murik ndi tawa rezi janla nopa ma shiwa ta rang jimje yak bo songwa te ni to nga tsu tini tawa kar chishu de rezi.
So this is the most important value or view or belief of Tibetan culture, that one should respect the law of cause and effect, respect the fact that karmic actions ensue from karmic results ensue from actions, and of course show compassion to other living beings, not harm them.
Tani ta tawa te ni boda nga tsu lagling ka thola tini deb gona jasha yabu da nga tsu lagling lan deb gona da te zu kamo nga tsu changma la kamo res.
Of course, if we're going to apply these two values in practice, to be able to do it in a completely perfect way, 100%, is quite difficult.
Yena tini nga tsu changma ga tini ta tanda nga tsu tini murik rigne ri nga tsu samlo ri samni changma ga tila zhenjok yak bo shi ji dang te so rang tini tsuwa nga nangla tini jini chokchok goni ta jacha nishi tona, simchi tona, jibchi tona, ngabchi tona ta rang ga odomoto tar go res.
However, given that this is part of our cultural tradition, this is a very important part of our culture, then this is something that everybody needs to strive to implement in their own lives. To what extent people need to work on it themselves, whether it's something they can do 30%, 40%, 50%, this is something that everyone should work hard on doing.
Teni rang so teni ta laglin la ta atif ta da te shi ba ma tsu teni chu chu ni bu chong chong choma la yin da man da lob go re zi ni ta.
And aside from just attempting to implement it in your own lives, in terms of your own children, it's something that you really must educate them on.
Teni bu chong chong chola teni te lab go na te yin da man da teni ta bu chong chong so boy da por ke te yin da man da shi go re.
And when you're educating younger children, it's also extremely important that you teach them to read Tibetan and to speak Tibetan.
Teni bogu chong chong so teni boy da por ke te ya bo mashina teni nga so teni ta bogu rigne re teni bogu samlo re teni mambo zi yore ta so na la teni boy ta mashin don mashina teni chawane teni chize yo hamko rang rigne ka ya hamko rang teni lecture ka ya hamko teni ziren ro re.
Because without being able to read Tibetan and without being able to speak Tibetan, then young children will not be able to understand or have access to Tibetan culture, the ideas and values of Tibetan culture.
Teni nga so teni to ringnin da la teni lo yapchak tongchak bar da teni ne go res.
When we're talking of talking about issues of culture, we need to view it in light of, millennia, 1,000 years, 2,000 years.
Pamjur zeyati nga chola shir guguri nga chola pamjur mena tinin chowa ketwa mare pamjur guguri ta yina te chu te mare.
Of course, economic development is something that we need. It is definitely something that is needed, but it is not the main thing.
Wancha se jita tini shona rang so rang la wancha yo na te wancha te la tini leka mambo le chokore de yina te chu te mare.
Power, for example, is something that if you have, you can do a lot of things, but this is not the main thing either.
Wancha tang pamjur la tini te lo jata lo tongo war ta schu ne thab gumare.
In terms of power and economic flourishing, these are not things that one can necessarily hold in one's grip for. But what we can hold on and onto and what we can further for a long period of time is our culture. Culture is something that can survive for hundreds and thousands of years.
Teni churang so karti teni ta America sachala yona da Europe ko sachala yona da karti so rang teni ta bo tela teni ta borkut matsup teni boig matsup teni chi jota teni churang so yona ta jima maung bana lorji ko thola teni mnichin rendores.
If having come to places like America and Europe, the West, and don't teach your children about traditional Tibetan culture, then in future history you'll be regarded as in an extremely negative light.
Garti susu utini perje katini yige mashi boing mashi ba porke mashi ba tini chi jota merb sum gatini jini tini ta bo chong chong to so chocho la kyunju she shik rezi kyunju she grezi ta ngarang ka phama ngam ulag jaz ni tini ze grezi.
If you don't teach your children how to read and write Tibetan, to speak Tibetan, then by the third generation they will turn around and blame and criticize their parents for failing to have done this.
Tini chuso uta pena tini ta gormu mamboda khangba chimboda langkhur tini yakboda so tini pogu chongchong la tini jingi malagna pogu chongchong ko onga phama nga blag zeg mareze.
If what you leave to your children is a lot of money or a big house or a big car, your children will not view these things as great legacies you've left them.
Tini phamala tini pamjur tini yo mare sacha tini mojambaz ka sacha la yoni te de ore te khorang la khayo mare je khorang so goa lengres.
The fact that their parents came from afar to a new place, they will understand how this has happened.
Rite porkut khorang so khanala nduwaje chama khanala.
Tibetan is something that or proficiency in the Tibetan language is something that you all have.
Thenga so boba ga sachane yongkhang ko mozi yin charti teni shigbo yena da changbo yena da sina menkan shigyang yo mare.
So so far as you're a Tibetan, that you come from Tibet, then regardless of whether you're rich and poor, it's something that everybody equally has.
To mahlabna teni te chorang ka tim thongshin mashi ba chorang ka tornang mashi warin ro.
And not teaching this and passing it on is a matter of great neglect on your own parts.
Rite ina anta nga chola ti khori ko wang kangar yo re jita pena America sa chanda on din jila yoni de gona teni ta pu cho teni ta poi ta por teni sha gona tela kangar anduzna kangar nduz.
Of course, that's not to say that there aren't challenges in the current environment in terms of being able to do this. There are clearly challenges.
Rite kangar yuna kangar te teni ta parkhat sad ni ta shawa under mat ta go res.
But really what we need to do is, in the face of these challenges, work towards ways of overcoming them.
Tani porkashi go res na nga so porkat ta jab go re ma to ba jambati inji ka jab go mari jak jab go mari ti ka ja mari ti ton ta mari.
In saying that we need to maintain the Tibetan language and speak Tibetan is of course not saying that we can't speak English or we shouldn't speak Chinese.
Naran so jak yang shi go re inji ka yang shi go re taron kar mambo shi na pe yak boris.
Of course we need to learn English, we need to be able to speak Chinese, in addition to this, learning other languages as well.
Ina so ka ta mashina tini ta ta jamba mambo shi na tini nga so gormu te zra yala phamba yore ma to ba jan phamba yo mare.
However, not being able to speak one's own language, but but knowing others may be of some benefit in terms of getting economic outcomes, but there is no benefit beyond this.
Tindi yindi nga tsu tini ta shilok la yo boba nam ga nala pe na tini chu bo tsu tini inji ga ta lobta ga nala ro go re tini za nyama da za pem ban da tindi re la kap kap tini chu boba ga tini bo tsu nyam tsu ne bo yi lab jin da tindi re ndu ta yinna tini ta to ngubu to ne ta pan chi chi to ko men du.
So most children needing to go to school during the week, they utilize some Saturdays and Sundays to get together and learn Tibetan. However, this is not enough. It's really not bringing any great benefit or effect.
So we
all need to really think, what should we do about this?
Teni shirtang teni kyotso to ngazo teni pena ta sacha boba yenna teni sacha jamba teni pena America yenna da Europe yenna da sacha jamba zlanjoni nduna mogos to sacha landoni denkin zu yenna teni tonda simla samlo tang gores.
So as Tibetans going to live in other countries, whether it be Europe or America, you need to bear three key things in mind.
Tonda simda garzina tonda tambot teni ngarang so lomba kang nang la nduna teni lomba ti chimda lomba ti teni luchtur ti la halipa ga zunjog ya boche gores.
So the first of these things is that in whichever society we are living, whichever place we've moved to, that we need to show great respect and obedience to the laws and customs of the place that we're living.
Teni lomba ti rignere lomba ti khorang so samlore to so sangmala teni ta zunjog ya boche gores.
And respect and show respect to the culture and beliefs of the place that we are living.
Pena chongchong zge tone teni samlo tang na peda nga zo zangja she lig dang teni kanik zge teni ta lamkhala mar teni jogna tanga zo ti sherdang longba ni nang la kandi shi ni she yo na te tang jamba tang rabo zu she ni teni ta te go re teni pena zangja she lig zama za lig teni ta so changma kang tone na khoso te la teni ta zunjok she pa dang teni go re.
So, for example, in terms of a small everyday life example, questions of hygiene and throwing away rubbish, etc., the way that people eat, etc., we need to act in a way that is at least at the same level or standard of what people in this society are doing.
Pena teni janak nanglo yena teni ta nga zo boba so teni ta nyam de ndung sa to so nanglo la ji samda yak bo machine pa da wota diglum yak bo mo chwa da wota teni yong de so ta ni nyang ma re chama yak bo she go re.
So for example, areas of China where there are significant Tibetan communities, quite often they don't really show great hygiene practices. Often there are disciplinary issues in terms of behavior. This is not acceptable.
Tindi yenna ta pena nga zo America gal ta sacha ndela yo na tini sacha New York tongchen ndela yo na New York na ka manam ka kandi che yo na te dang jawo she go re.
So for example, in a place like New York, if this way you've come, then how you need to behave should be in accordance with the way things are done here.
Tini tonda ni pa ta tini ta jamba dang janda shi jamba ga tini ta chimda jamba ga lukto la zunjok she go re ta yena rang tini ta rigne te tini yenda man da yak bo chongkyo she to go re.
The second thing, of course, is in addition to, or while at the same time as respecting the way that things are done in the place that you're living, it's absolutely essential that our own culture be preserved.
Tindi yendi te soso go tini rigne te yak bo tini she go na 겸상 거 로소 자tin 교육 겸상 거 로소 때 할리바 가르침 보레.
And in doing this, it's extremely important the role of education within the household.
겸상 거 로소 약보요 파마 조금 통신 약보 시나 코리 간다즈 그나 내나 되니 또 랑거 르네 때말 때 총교 약보 시기다 되니 긴 약보 탓게도 시탑 그래.
If individual families really emphasize and prioritize the role of education, then it is possible to preserve culture and maintain it, to further it.
Tindi yen sarti teni ta soso go teni rigne go tone katang yige ni ka chawachi di thola teni nga zo chuluk teni ta halipa karchim bo chigre te chure chuluk ta bare te mayem ba teni soso go teni to rigne kang yo na to so thama teni yakboz teni ginzim she ke ta te la pen thongshim she ya ta karchim bore.
So it's really important upon the foundation of learning Tibetan language, the written Tibetan language and spoken, Tibetan language, that Tibetan religion is learned, that Tibetan faith is inculcated, and further that other aspects of the Tibetan cultural tradition are studied and preserved.
Teni te tonda ni ba teni tonda samba de ngare jena nga cho sanin de la yong ni teni so so kavli jam ni gormo te ra yong di teni tin na ne teni kala kansam zu rang po sha tang go re kala kansam zu jong zu zu teni te sanin di te pe na jangbo yen na da gargi yen na da teni chi te loma pe na lo talan ro matam kan teni yon na da america yen na jangbo mangbon thong jin do wa o te su la teni rokhyur shi go re.
And the third point is that of the money that you earn, or the money that you have, that a certain portion is spent, of course, on yourself, and then that a portion is also spent on helping others, whether that be the poor or elderly, people who can't afford to go to school.
Teni sachandeni nga so kavli jab so gormote zarana ta te ngarang rang yen te america to ngi kavli ngi parjin goji mari samne teni samlo tang jo mari.
Thinking that, oh, this money that I've earned here is the result of my own hard efforts, and that I don't need to share it with anyone else in the wider American community is not okay.
Teni sachandi teni gele go choba dang teni chopan fulize chopan go teni ta choba ta so nangla teni ta gormo mambo me na chakare so gaji yo na chokore so sem sambare nga cho bok sambam choya je gre teni goni ti nangla jini ji jig go res.
Everyone should donate a certain amount of money and support charitable and welfare organizations. Of course, it doesn't have to be a lot of money. Everybody can do so in accordance with their own individual situation.
Teni nga cho teni boba teni mamboz nyamde yo nanda nyonyong ze leme nanda chimsang sig leme nanda so rang rngni la ta teni teni jambala no pa ma shi pa tang teni jambala panch to kang to teni shi ji to yong boba ga mo yin char ti teni she go re.
So regardless of whether it's a lot of Tibetans living in one area, or only a few, or even just one single family, then in accordance with the Tibetan cultural tradition, people should live in a way that is not harmful to others and is in fact of benefit to.
Teni to hal liba ti tondak sambo to teni nga so boba ji yo mare sacha jambala teni mog longba ga na to dingkhing ge murg si na te go re ji ti samde.
These three things are extremely important to Tibetans, regardless of where they're living, and people living anywhere.
Tani chute de nga so teni ringne ga na da samlo ga na ni hal liba ga kachim bo sigres.
Within our Tibetan culture, religion is extremely important.
Teni nga so pe na america ga nafshuk la na teni ta boba ga teni chusuk haliba mangbon deus.
In places like America, there are a great number of Tibetan Dharma centers.
Teni boba yang teni to when California and so la boba ya tong chang je nga teni yore zeng de pe mangbon deus.
And in places like California, there are large numbers of Tibetans, 4,000, 5,000.
Yena de boba ga teni jishak to so de boba ga chusuk na lan ro ni lojong she ga mandux.
However, of these people, they don't really go to Tibetan Dharma centers and study there.
Ti jimsen de kala thing de so go samlo tang go sares.
Why this is the case is something that you all need to think about.
Chikshina nga cho teni to ta so la yang che pe na khashi to gelig yam ba da khashi to kwarji yam ba da khashi to nyangma yam ba da to tindi yena teni pe na nga so nyinjum to na teni chusuk yo na oda ngarang shetang phayerni nga cho bola yo pi kapsa nga gelig yena teni ka tan dana nga dala lep chawi kes te ngarang la gelig chusuk me teni nyangma chusuk zon di nyinjum la te ma to ba me ban ra oda yang na nga phayerni nga nyangma yena sachan dala teni ta thag nyesa ti la teni to nyangma chusuk me pa gelig chusuk ma to me pa teni yena to ro mandu ban ra o teni eres te yena te chawani go mares.
Perhaps the reason for this reluctance to go to these Dharma centers is due to a fact, or the feeling that, or perhaps this Dharma center is from a different lineage to that which I traditionally have been in my hometown in Tibet. If this is the reason that people are reluctant to go to Dharma centers, then it's not a good one.
Fire la yo pin nerkavna chik sarcha gelig nyang man ra tin mambo shal yore ta nga so sachan denri zela lep chardi tani ta chik 차버지지요 말이지. 그거 나라 손아 찍바리스.
So whilst in Tibet there is perhaps a lot of distinction made between different schools of Tibetan Buddhism, Sakya, Kagyu, Gelug, Nyingma, whatever, after we have arrived in a place like America, then these distinctions have no validity at all.
드니 가서 보고 사자라더니 보고 총총 로슴 로진든지 총총 소에더니 다 지금 공방나란로 제다더니 샹차진라더니 다 지금더니 라만람 통나 야퍼진라더니 그추 다바도 코수 셈거나란도 아지 보고 총총 로슴 로지잖라.
In Tibet, children of 3 or 4 years of age are taken to monasteries and they're educated about how to behave, how to prostrate, take their hat off when they see a lama.
드니 티 다바트 강니 용어레즈나 티 라마가 코솔라티니 사바레즈나 마레지 보고 총총 로슴 로지잔즈라 라마즈 치케양테니 더 호소타카요 마레 티 라마가 샤파마 코솔라 사바레즈나 마레지.
And the faith of young children in Tibet is not the result of lamas imposing education on them at all.
더나티 기르근 그 사바레즈나 마레지 가서더니 보고 총총 로슴 로지잔즈 가서 롭달란도 마레 기르근 그 사바야 마레지.
And their belief and the respect that they show for religious conventions is also not the result of their teachers teaching them this either. They're too young, in fact, to have ever been to school.
오나 코랑 것들이 다바드 강니 용어레즈나 드니 아파 아마초 것들이 더 삼니더니 고소 나니 용어레즈.
Their ideas and practices are the direct result of their mothers and fathers who have taught them these things.
드니 가서 보방은 나라 드니 다 보고 총총 임비네 그분이 더 파마서 잡라 커니 드니 샹차르 드니 더 돈반돈 드니 곰방은 나라 꼬란로 곰방은 나라 드니 한잠 촌잔로 곰방은 나라 추석요 드니 나 보고 총총 로식로니 잡라 커니 로레 드니 칼레 콘소 질라 타바약 보드니 다 케오레지 보고 나라.
The way, in fact, that this faith is inculcated into the consciousnesses of young children in Tibet is the way that from a very young age, strapped to their parents' back, they're taken to the monastery, they prostrate with them, they do recitations with them, they do kora with them, and it's this way that young children are inculcated in the Buddhist faith.
드니 계속 오양 다 보고 총총들이 더 loksom 로지 잔다서 더 춘니 드니 더 가촌들이 보고 추석다 뜻소 나란 조드니 지드니 샹차제다 드니 더 꼬라시제다 드니 라마타바요나 뜻소당 냠드니 소진다 뜻소 인담다 고그레.
So it's very important among the young children in the Tibetan communities here that they be taken to Dharma centers and that they learn how to prostrate and do kora and sit in assembly with monks and lamas.
딱가르데 곰바다 추석고 나라 계속 마송나 드니 라는 그 첨라데 첨상가 나라데니 타강다든지 야보요 고레 그런 것들 호소 야보 잡고 그랬다 뜻이 첨상 참말라든지 샤킹오제고나데서 가보인지리.
If it's not possible to take children to a Dharma center or a monastery, then it's necessary to have a religious space, a shrine in one's house, and to pursue this education oneself, although this may be difficult.
든지 지적다 드니 결혼초더니 다 보청마더니 다 보거더니 릉니머시 추고 따밤에 든지 지적다 드니 가서 아메리카라 용니 골모테즈 론나더니 보청마더니 가서 서 용지 텔레 파르 드니 로제다 할리바가더니 파르 가서 쇼르지도 침보즈 쇼르 서 라라테즈 톱지도 골모테즈 마토 잔지지 마토 바든리 렌도레스.
But if we can't do this, then in coming to America, even though we might have got some economic benefit from being here, actually what we will have lost will be far, far greater than what we've gained.
드니 파르쇼지도 드니 머럽시마도 상마 파르쇼송오레데 락송오레데니 서론지도 골모카시즈레스.
What we will have lost, in fact, is our tradition and culture. What we will have gained in return is just some money.
디톨라 인담만다 삼로탄고 사랭에 삼건도스.
This is something that I think everybody really needs to think seriously about.
옛날다 대랑 마토방아서 식당 남긴 때니가서 보바데즈 망보요사든지 문득대 보바망보 메시지가 나라 보바가 또 돈닥닥닥 셨다나 양 잠바초 때니야 데즈 년도지 말에 뜨네 샤지 거거 약보쇼 마송 대랑아서 보바데즈 망본도 또 샤바인스.
So the reason that I'm saying this today is because we've got so many Tibetans gathered together in one place. On other occasions, there haven't necessarily been so many Tibetans and they haven't been interested in these things. I'm taking advantage of so many Tibetans being gathered here today.
Dur Denisha to so Murshimata Murshimata Mepashi Jana daily Sapchiva the Tili Kyurgut Chipachi Kyurgut Chimbuchi Yomaris.
Other than beyond losing one's cultural tradition of one's people, there is nothing more, there's no other loss that can be more serious or severe than this.
Then it should Yaboz Mashisona, Atotini Bokanani, Denita, Da, Muyabochi and Auta, the Nichi Shava Tamu Dimbole, Kat Leanda, that's what some chew some loan on the young gory, chew Yaboz Machina, the Nijima Muyabozion, the Halipa Cabores.
So ideas about how to be a good person and how to undertake one's actions in a good way all derive from the Tibetan religious tradition, and without a good understanding of the religious tradition, then in the future it will be really difficult to have a proper understanding of how we should carry out our lives and actions in a proper way.
Then Tarnayant, Kashila, Karyuji Marita, Sacha Jamba Mu, Sacha Tindizula Tona, Tasarka Yonan, Soatini, Tola Yabomayon, Tenichin, the Sayan Yabome, Tendiciona, Zota, the Sotola, some Lotan de Gemato, Barinita, the Sotola, the Samlo, Yabotan Mashua, Tendi, Yona, the Carmenduzi.
Of course, it's there are some people who in fact encounter a lot of difficulty in arriving here. Their livelihood, their lives, their financial situation, they're all quite unstable. So the fact that they are concerned with their economic situation more so than culture is something that we can understand and sympathize with.
Teni Tatartana, Tini Mambuzilla, Tini Soa, Tota, Gangatoni, and Tini Halipa, Yapota, Gibut, and Rimaina, Soso, Soatinita. Kasuya that is so saying now to do a teacups, the Nita, as a sarkatini, Reniga Tota, so Tolatini, Samlo, Tango, Remato, but Muntaniti, Samlo Matana, the Nick Jimatini, Marvijima Langdore.
However, these days there are quite a considerable number of people who have achieved a stable standard of living. Perhaps they're not super rich, but they have achieved a state of living that is quite okay. So at this point in time, if we don't turn our minds to cultural preservation, it will be a great danger.
Then also walk back a non-lion, the Tanshibari, the Tamakatini, Katan Yeri, Tendrawazaka, the Sosotini, Jitini, Murika, Juneri, Churin, the Sotola Tamakatini, Shigam, Baba Shigayori.
And it's important that Tibetans inside Tibet also make a great efforts in terms of language and culture and religion.
Then Natsu Rinda, the young Atso Murchi go or Chiri Murize, the Dishin Rala Samlotana, Murjan Pass Munsi.
So saying that we need these things for our people, that this is something for our Tibetan people, etc. I am not advocating, or I don't see myself as being nationalistic. However, in terms of preserving the complete Buddhist thought in one tradition, then aside from the Tibetan cultural tradition, there is not another one that has managed to do this.
Teni samlon di tini ngaso bo murgchi bo marin zambalang yongzola maumba na pambaya boyongore.
So these ideas and these values are not simply of benefit to Tibetan people, but in the future will be of great benefit to peoples in the world at large.
Di shirna ngaso tini chongchi yakbo shego rez ni tini zegre ma to pandam mula pantoya da tini mayna da ngaso chongchi shego ya ji mendux.
And so it's for this reason that we really need to work hard to preserve this tradition. If it's not going to be of benefit to anyone, then there wouldn't be any need to do so.
Teni ngaso ringnindo yena teni da pamba tini zambalanga masala yena teni pamba yoya ga teni ringni zreta yena chongchi ting aranso shego rez.
Of course, this is our tradition will be of benefit to people anywhere, but the role of preserving it is ours.
Te indi teni keso wayang ta soso teni lojong yakbo shikita chula nyamlin yakbo shikita teni tiso tola teni sarwa samlo sarwa tangne kandishe go titola yendamanda samlo tango res.
So everybody really needs to develop new ideas about the importance of studying, the importance of practicing religion. This is something that we need to arrive at new understandings of.
Ngatu chunda gotini tata ngatu boba nangchi bo matsit par bena Zhongguo nangla samlo tangba na ti yang nangla yang mamambola pantok yores.
So religion, for example, is not something that's just of benefit to Tibetan people. If we look inside China, for example, we can see that Tibetan religion is of great benefit to many Chinese as well.
Mamambo soso gotini semga nangatini dungar mebata tso tola pe pamba pamba yabon jongo yores.
It's of great benefit to helping people eliminate their suffering.
Tenda was ngatu noshok gotini mayena tini koso mamambola tini ngatu tini chuta ringnin di tini koso gotini ta semga nala dungar yonganda ta tso tola yang tini pamba yabo yongo yores.
And great benefit of people to the West, our religious and cultural tradition in terms of helping people reduce and eliminate their suffering.
Tendi enti tini mala pantoya ringni tendi yembi gemsenji tini ngacho tini chongchoshe gore tendi zegre mato bandan de ngacho wotere tini ngacho wochi gore zendi tini murgrang likaja tini mares.
So it's because our tradition is one that is beneficial to humanity that we need to protect it. It's not because it's ours and therefore we need to protect it on that basis. It's not underpinned by a nationalist reasoning.
Tini tendi insarti tini ngacho tini ta nangla ngacho tini bok nangla karzi tola tini ngacho tini ta lerka tini tini leni chamaga tini chege yore tini chozo yang tini ta karzi tola sherdang tini ngacho mangchok nangni na tini tsawani shamazawa tini ngacho nangla yang lege yo mari shila yang go marita yena tini shilogla tini chakin zombo yagbore na tena tez jenyong tangna pe yagbores.
So it's in this spirit that in Tibet we work on promoting vegetarianism. It's something that also needs to happen in Tibetan communities outside as well. In terms of lay people, we're not saying that individuals have to be completely vegetarian, but of course it's beneficial if people can work towards eating less meat.
Tini khabarta tini ngacho ta boba ngama tini ngacho la zaji tini control maybe tini chi chigni ramandra zaji ta bamba chukchang ramandra zaya to so the tsawani mazana yak bore te guba mandukse. Haishe haishe to so mazana ga.
Oh yeah, but in terms of consuming seafood and things like that, then it is certainly better if we refrain from doing this.
Yeah, tini bamba chukchang to so mambo tini to zana tini semje mambo tini chokla tini no ba kire tenda was kana tini to ngacho susu libola yang tini to no ba mambo yongo yore tendi gina tini ngacho bok murgla yang tini zatur tata yang mendik tasar ke tini ngacho la to ji tela lojong shi ma shi ji mendukse.
So eating and consuming seafood and things like this brings a lot of unnecessary suffering to a lot of lot of individual lives of living beings, and this is something that we should not take on.
Teni ngacho pena teni Amerikal tawala yongna dra sashakang la dona dra longba ti nangla teni murg tela ti ringni ti nangla yopi teni yakbo to tam chibo ngacho lojong che go re tanglin she go re laglin she go re.
So what we need to take on and what we need to study from the cultures, the new cultures that we arrive in, are the good or positive or beneficial aspects of those cultures.
The yina teni murg ti nangla ti samlo nangla ringne nangla ti jam la no pakiata teni janla teni ta te phan man to yata teni teni ta ringni digbo da samlo digbo yona ta so nga so lojong che nyang mares.
However, practices and ideas that are harmful or not beneficial in nature, then these are things that we should not take on or learn.
Pena nga so boba ga yina teni ta phamala teni ta yabushi ate hal liba ka chimbola teni tsgre je burgi cho phamala teni tsgre yabushi ki ta teni ta haliba ga tong chimbola tsgre.
In Tibetan culture, for example, respecting one's parents and treating them well is considered extremely important.
Yina tartan zambolong ka thola teni ta burgi cho teni phamala teni ta tsgre moshi yabu moshi ni teni phama mambo gargi ne kamna teni sim kyo ni teni rangchok chen kan teni gargi na la mambo yores.
However, in the wider world today, It's quite frequent now that children don't treat their parents well, they don't respect them. Members of the older generations, they feel extremely sad as a result of this, and some even commit suicide.
Teni tesu tola teni da nga chong ngama teni strojing kana la country yo patat ya po laglen la teni athemetep ta gores.
So what we need to do is really, in this kind of situation, apply our own cultural precedents.
Teni tera nga so teni kajafya pa teni korko ya bo chanson pe ga bo chanson teni changmala tiji cheje yin.